On today's podcast, we're going to discuss the topic of an overlooked key to success, and going to talk a little bit about humility, kind of getting our ego basically put off to the sidelines so we can be able to achieve success, and I think more importantly, our client success. Some of this, actually all of this, stems from three different situations, and I'll be a little bit transparent in this particular podcast, but three different situations I had run across over the last couple weeks. And as I begin to think about some of these situations that had happened, and my initial, to be honest with you, inappropriate response, the not having the right response, really forced me to sit down for a while and begin to jot down as far as my mindset and my approach in regards to how I handle situations, and ultimately making sure that my client success is achieved, and in turn my success is achieved as well. And Zig Ziglar used to say, one of my favorite lines, if you help enough people get what they want, you'll get what you want. And I was spent this last week in Florida. I'll be heading to Utah tomorrow, and as I do quite often on the plane, I'll read. And I began picking up, did pick up the book, Ray Dalio's book on principles, and about halfway through it. It's a lengthy book, about 500-600 pages, and strong recommended read if you haven't read it. And it was about, maybe 200 pages through the book. And in this particular chapter, in one of the chapters, I think it's the third principle in the book, I may be wrong on that, but he talks about being open-minded. And it really kind of took some of these thoughts that I had written about, and kind of just really got into the almost into the weeds. And I'm kind of like reading this. I'm like, is this guy reading my mind as far as the way that I'd handle a few situations over the prior couple weeks? And I was really closed-minded in my approach to handling those. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And it really all just kind of boiled down beyond just not being open-minded, but just being prideful and not being humble enough to accept the fact that I'm not always right, and then also to go alongside with clients and rejoice in their victories. Let me talk about that a little bit here. 3 points today. First, be humble enough to be wrong and handle rejection. Be humble enough to be wrong and to handle rejection, or ultimately, as Ray Dalio would put it, to be open-minded. A couple weeks, actually it was about 3 weeks or so ago, I was actually, someone on my team was working on a tax return, and I was getting a little bit of a pushback from a client, and had come and had asked me about the question that the client had to have, and my initial response was, the client isn't right. That this is the way that this particular tax credit is to be applied, and I just let them know the client to let the client know that. Well, the client had come back to me and said, "Josh, you probably should look into this." And initially, I was a little bit frustrated, and kind of like, hey, I'm the expert in this matter. Don't be questioning me, and that was kind of my initial response. But obviously, I can't go back to the client and say that. But as I began to kind of look into it, come to find out, I was wrong. There was a last-minute change in the way that the credit was to be applied, and I had to go back to the client and basically admit that our initial approach was incorrect, and that we would go ahead and make sure that the return was prepared correctly. And so we need to make sure that we're humble enough to be wrong and to accept that fact. Next, number 2, be humble enough to accept when a customer seeks other direction or advice. There's a scriptural principle that says, in a multitude of counselors there is safety or security. And I think for all of us, we need to have that counsel around us, those mentors around us, whether you call them a tribe of mentors, whether you call it your own personal counsel that you have around you, but people that you go to seek advice when you run into a problem. And for some of our clients and for friends and family, I sit in that seat. And of course, as an accountant, our clients do reach out to us for tax direction and tax advice. But sometimes we work through this. There are areas that we don't have all the answers to. And ran into a situation to where a client had come to us, and we're really trying to work through getting a loan. It's one of these government grants as it relates to COVID, and kind of working through this particular situation. And I was very, very clear on the rules. And kind of going through, and I went back to the client and I said, you know what, I just don't know how this is going to work. And they went actually to their banker, and they had a really good relationship with their banker, and began to talk to the banker. And the banker had come up with a possible solution. We don't know whether or not the solution is going to work, if they will be granted the funds. But it was really an ingenious idea, and something I had not at all thought of. And this kind of came right off the back of the first situation I told you about. So when I went back this time, I wasn't at all staunch in my approach. I was more willing to go to them and say, well, this is the way I understand it. And then, of course, they felt comfortable going and asking further questions as well. And ultimately, at the end, I think we'll run into a situation, hopefully, to where this will be, in the end, about a $140,000 win for our client. And so making sure that we're humble enough when a client is willing to go and seek other advice, even if it's maybe it's a pathway that we don't see or we don't understand, or something that maybe it's a little bit outside the box of the way that we normally may handle a matter. So be humble enough to accept when a customer seeks other direction or advice. And then third and lastly, be humble enough to ask for forgiveness. This stems off of a situation we've been dealing with for a number of months with a client, and kind of working through it's a real small company, working through a purchase agreement matter, and it was really, really frustrating. It was frustrating to the client. It was frustrating to me. We'd come through. We had provided everything that this third party had asked for. Then they had kind of gone and sought other advice and had come back and just kind of really just creating just kind of a real pain point for the client, and then kind of in turn for a pain point for me. And it was getting to be a little bit frustrated. And I ended up shooting back a rather, I would say, a little bit of a curt response to the client's request for help. And of course, it came out of frustration. Client was frustrated. I was frustrated. And it kind of ended up breaking one of those rules of I kind of have internally, and probably many of us have, as far as kind of waiting a little bit of time before we send out a response. And it was kind of one of those things that, I sent that response. It was in the early morning hours, and I shot the response over, and it really just kind of ate at me the rest of the day. And literally that evening, I was sitting in a meeting and sitting there, and I had my phone, and it was just eating at me. And I had to quickly, I just shot my client a text, and I apologized for just being curt and not being understanding and as helpful as really as I should have been in this situation. So an overall key to success, and that is to be humble, to put our ego on the sidelines, to be willing to listen, to be willing to understand where our clients, our customers, coming from, and to really be the person that we should be for them. To be humble enough to be wrong, be humble enough to handle rejection, be humble enough to accept when a customer seeks other advice, and be humble enough to ask for forgiveness when we're wrong. Hope this podcast brought you some value. If it did, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the podcast. Have a wonderful day.